Hello friends and welcome back to my 2018 Game of the Year celebration. We've made it to the final day, which can mean only one thing. It's time for my personal top 10 games of 2018. This past year had so many amazing games and it felt so bizarre to me seeing some titles I truly love not make the cut, but that's just how packed things were and I didn't even get to play everything I would have liked to. If you're watching today's video first, I hope you'll check out some of my other categories from the previous days, as there are some incredibly fun and important games amongst those awards that I just couldn't quite squeeze into this final list. As ever, these are all my own personal picks, but I'd love to hear what you would have chosen as well. Roll it! ...2018's Game of the Year. Game of the Year. Special mention, Tetris Effect. I don't normally do honourable mentions, but this is an especially weird case. At its core, Tetris Effect is the same Tetris we've been playing for decades, or at least since the likes of T-spins and holds came in when modern Tetris was introduced in the late 90s. However, it turns out that a well-playing game of Tetris is still one of the most satisfying experiences around, and the actual game feel of Tetris Effect is right up there with the best of them. But as an experience, Tetris Effect is something else, a magical journey through these beautiful vistas of bright lights and ethereal soundscapes, the sounds of your spins and drops seamlessly flowing into the soundtrack to create a wonderfully reactive experience that really makes Tetris feel magic once again. Tetris Effect is still the Tetris I grew up with, but it brought a warmth to my heart and reminded me just what made those blocks and lines so magical in the first place. Number 10, 2 Point Hospital. As a huge fan of Theme Hospital ever since I was a young'un, I was hugely excited for this spiritual successor from 2 Point Studios, formed by developers from the old days of Bullfrog and Lionhead who are behind the original game. 2 Point Hospital manages to recapture everything I remembered and loved about the original whilst still managing to feel fresh and modern at the same time. The core loop is taken almost whole cloth from Theme Hospital, but the UI and interface has been polished and tweaked in smart ways, with notable changes only appearing in ways which felt like clever improvements from the original. That original Theme Hospital holds up surprisingly well if you can get it to run on modern machines, so it's unsurprising that the developers stuck fairly closely to that original format. As such, you could mistake 2 Point Hospital for a straight remake, but the mechanical additions help freshen things up and keep the game feeling more modern, while having a completely original set of weird and wonderful illnesses to contend with and treat in all manner of humorous ways, makes 2 Point Hospital feel like having that original experience for the first time all over again. Number 9, God of War. I had fun with the original God of War around the time of its release, but I didn't stick with the series much past that. Sony Santa Monica's new spin didn't immediately grab my attention at first either, with the bad dad Kratos pitch feeling a little rote out of the gate and the slower, more deliberate combat initially feeling like a frustrating struggle against being immediately wombo comboed anytime more than 2 enemies were on screen. However, around the time you meet Freya and arrive at the Lake of the Nine, I began to fall in love with the stunning world design. The switch to Norse mythology opened up a whole new book for the writers to pull from, and they do a great job of diving into the grisly history of the Norse pantheon whilst also providing their own spin on some of its more familiar characters. That roster consists of some wonderfully written figures with a surprising amount of joviality and wry humour that injects God of War with the likeable charm that it has lacked in the past. For a series that has previously been so focused on frantic action and unbridled anger, this new entry features many more quiet moments of atmosphere or introspection. Quietly rowing between islands, just the splash of your aura accompanying quiet conversation between Kratos, Atreus and Mimir provides these wonderful slices of reflection or exposition interspersed between the combat. As for said combat, oh my. Past my initial misgivings, it took me a while to really settle into the flow of God of War's new combat design, which feels uniquely its own in a way that's difficult to pin down, blending the series' traditional combo-focused character action with the sort of measured, deliberate pacing that has become popular over the past decade. Once it clicked, however, I was completely hooked and salivating over every chance for a scrap. It's fast and frantic, but with a real sense of crushing weight behind everything. Blows crunching into your foes and melodic clangs of clashing metal abound. Encounters feel much more strategic than those of past entries, with positioning and movement as important as your combos, parries and dodges. There are a few too many repeated mini-boss types, but I was having too much fun barreling my way through every Draugr, Wolver and Tatzelworm in my way to mind. Number 8. Celeste. It's been a good while since I got into this style of massacre splatformer, with Super Meat Boy always having been the recurring gold standard, from its striking art style to its tight platforming and infectious soundtrack. Celeste is the first game to truly step up as a serious contender to the splatforming crown for me, excelling in all 3 of those areas and doing so alongside a funny, heartwarming story about a young girl finding herself and making friends. Madeline's tale of anxiety and self-doubt is one that certainly struck a chord with me, and the way it plays out through both cutscenes and in-game mechanics works really well. It doesn't take long at the start of her journey for her inner feelings to manifest in corporeal form, and over the course of the game we see Madeline go from physically running away from the part of her she fears, to utilising her demons to help her progress, dealing with demoralising setbacks, attempting to confront her problems head on, and finally being able to embrace that part of her and use it to propel her towards success. There are even some clever uses of mechanics to accentuate certain scenarios, such as when Leo instructs Madeline to visualise a floating feather in order to control her breathing and help her through a panic attack. Celeste's wonderful storytelling will stay with me for a long time, but what makes it work in the moment is just how good it feels to play. Your toolkit is relatively simple: a single jump, an air dash that recharges when you land on solid ground, and the ability to grab onto and climb walls for a short time. Yet the combination of these, along with a series of unique mechanics introduced in each subsequent level, are more than enough to keep things feeling exciting and fresh over the course of Madeline's whole adventure. Your movements always feel tight and under control, and I always felt like I could pull anything off if I just gave it enough practice. The base game offers a very satisfying level of challenge with a nice difficulty curve over the course, but that is supplemented by the dozens of optional strawberries hidden across each level, which require you to attempt tougher, longer stretches of platforming or find your way into hidden areas of the map. Going back and trying to find every last one, or tracking down the even rarer B-sides and crystal hearts, kept me engrossed for hours after I'd already finished the main game. The best splatformers can keep you on one screen for ages without it ever feeling unfair or frustrating, and Celeste pulls that off with aplomb. And to top it off, Lena Raine's gorgeous, amazing soundtrack is the perfect complement to Madeline's adventure, and still recalls those same emotions I initially experienced every time I hear it, even months later on. Number 7. Hitman 2.
Well, it's official.
2016's Hitman reimagining was a revelation, finally achieving the true potential I always felt the core concept was aiming for, but wasn't ever able to quite achieve due to platform limitations on earlier hardware. It was so well done, just barely missing out on my top spot for the year, that merely a fresh set of levels and a continuation of the narrative would have been enough to keep my attention for a sequel. Yet the now independent IO Interactive carefully tweaked and evolved various aspects of the game to create an even more polished and satisfying series of sandboxes to play in. On a mechanical level, Hitman 2 adds a ton of cool touches. Functioning mirrors force you to really rethink all those times you lured an unfortunate passerby into a fancy bathroom and clocked them in the back of the head for their clothes. The wonderfully handy briefcase allows you to smuggle all sorts of outrageous contraband past security with ease, as well as functioning as a rather deadly weapon on its own merits. The variety of new tools and tweaks included offer you even more options to go about your nefarious deeds, but ensure you'll have to be even more atop your game to succeed. You can also bring all the previous game's maps and missions into this entry to take advantage of all those mechanical additions here. As for the new levels, Hitman 2's locales are even larger and more complex than its predecessors, yet the consistency of quality is even higher across the board, with no real low points of note. There are a couple of slightly awkward objectives to deal with, but for the most part, things feel even more freeform and open this time around. Whether you're carefully sneaking away through these intricate clockwork playgrounds for the first time, observing everything at play and finding your footsteps, or barreling your way through crowds and scarpering up pipes leaving a trail of chaos in your wake, Hitman 2 is perhaps even more of a joy than IO's previous entry, even if it's mostly treading the same ground.
But that is not for now. For now, focus on your business and what you do best, friend. That is all.
I will do that.
Number 6. Dead Cells. It's been a while since I was last truly gripped by a roguelike, and I'm not usually the biggest fan of side-scrolling action platformers either, yet Dead Cells almost immediately clicked for me. I held off playing much during the early access period to save my enthusiasm for its full release, and it only took me a matter of minutes to fall instantly under its spell once more. There's a real tightness to all the mechanics in Dead Cells, from the jump height to the roll distance, and it offers some very welcome generosity in its combat, such as being able to evade mid-combo and then pick back up where you left off. It's a very player-friendly setup which makes you feel incredibly capable, but the flip side of that bargain is that encounters in Dead Cells can be relentless and punishing at times. Enemies can appear in huge numbers and damage will rack up extremely quickly, especially in later levels, so that precision and leniency with the combat systems is needed just to keep up at times. Thankfully, you can build up to some incredibly powerful setups if you come across the right equipment. I've had a few runs where the perfect piece of gear had me blowing up endgame foes in 1 or 2 hits. The delightful thing about Dead Cells balancing, however, is that even the incredibly potent runs don't feel unstoppable the way some of the more overpowered combos can feel in other roguelikes. You're always vulnerable to some extent. I was already having a great time with Dead Cells in its release form, so I was slightly worried when developers Motion Twin announced that they were reworking a lot of the core systems in a large update. However, it turned out I had no need to worry, as their changes all felt really smart. The core stats were reworked to rectify an issue with late game scaling, damage reduction was altered to prevent it from feeling like an essential part of every build, time lock doors were moved to the inter-level safe zones to make attaining them more reliable, and a bunch of additional challenge and run customization options were added in at the same time. The base game in Dead Cells was already incredible, but it's clear that Motion Twin were watching players closely and listening to community feedback to help influence their future design decisions, and it's only further improved upon the experience. While I'm nowhere near finished with the core game, I've actually probably spent more time by now with the daily challenge runs, because it's so easy to hop in for just a few minutes and either aim for a single clear of any time, or spend a while mapping out the entire area and experimenting with possible routes and item combinations before going for that perfect high score run. It's also a fantastic way to experience items you might not have unlocked yet in your game, which then looped back around to making me want to make it further through the main mode's progression. Regardless of whether I make it right to the end of a run, take a big gamble on my build and die halfway through a promising attempt, or fail gloriously 3 minutes into an attempted speedrun, every single journey through the dungeons of Dead Cells is an absolute joy from beginning to heart-stopping end. Number 5. Astrobot Rescue Mission. If you'd asked me at the start of 2018 whether I thought I'd get into VR anytime soon, I'd have probably told you that I didn't think it had happened for at least another couple of years, because I hadn't really seen that killer app. Astrobot certainly wasn't the sole reason for me picking my headset up, but along with some good sale prices on PSVR bundles, the hype around Astrobot certainly helped push me over the edge into a purchase. As my first real introduction into VR, Astrobot couldn't have set the bar much higher. From the earliest levels, I was wowed by the scale of the environments rising up around me, and the simple act of spotting a video feed of my character and realising I could move around using my body instantly put a smile on my face. The titular Astrobot is an incredibly jovial companion, waving cheerfully as he walks past. Controlling him feels tight and satisfying, and having to platform around terrain stretching off into the distance or winding up around your head feels incredibly natural thanks to the depth perception offered by VR. Key to this is always making the player feel involved. While controlling Astrobot is the primary focus, you have a physical presence in the stage as well. This means you can get involved in all sorts of ways, from headbutting your way through fragile walls to dodging missiles and knocking footballs back at enemy turrets. The gadgets which attach themselves to your controller offer up even more ways to interact, with the grappling hook, water cannon, shuriken and more helping Astrobot to feel more like a co-op adventure than a simple platformer at times. The stages themselves are fairly linear for the most part, but there's just enough width to them that you don't feel like you're simply wandering a preset route, and the variety of environments you travel through keep things feeling fresh. There is also plenty of secrets dotted about. Levels themselves are mostly easy enough to make it through, but tracking down every last hidden robot and chameleon took me many more attempts. The bonus levels push you even further, and some of the time trials and high score challenges there are amongst the most exhilarating platforming sequences I've ever made it through. The boss stages have a very old school platformer vibe to them, which is a delight to revisit, yet the VR elements make them feel fresh and new. Whether it's having to lean left and right to physically dodge incoming attack birds as you jump after birdie, or gliding over leaping squid formations while facing off against a giant mechanical shark. At every twist and turn, Astrobot continued to wow me. Each new level and mechanic a surprise, each challenge it put in my way just tempting enough to push myself through, each song on the joyful soundtrack bringing warmth to my heart. I played it in short bursts, a level or two each day that I played, and I always looked forward to strapping on the headset once more and diving back into that wonderful virtual world. The only downside of all this wonderment was that eventually I wrung every last drop out of it and was left with this incredibly high standard for future VR games to live up to. If we ever get another PSVR game as good as Astrobot, I'll be a very happy chappy. Number 4. Into the Breach. FTL developers Subset Games turning their hand to the turn-based tactics genre was an easy pitch for me to get on board with, and they certainly didn't disappoint. From concept to execution, Into the Breach is a mechanical tour de force that had me puzzling for ages over static boards, mulling over every possible permutation in search of that perfect turn. Key to Into the Breach's appeal is that it puts all the information into the hands of the player. So often, my frustration with strategy games, particularly this brand of turn-based grid-based strategy, comes from the random elements that lead to unpredictable outcomes or wild swings based on rolls of the dice. Here that's almost never a consideration. At the outset of every turn you're informed down to the finest details exactly how the enemy and environment will act once your turn ends. This makes Into the Breach less about prediction and turns it almost into a puzzle game of sorts. Every turn an attempt to put out as many fires as possible whilst conserving your resources as best you can. The relatively small play areas and minimal number of units in play betray the complexity at work here. Every turn has a myriad different potential approaches and there's almost never a perfect solution to each problem. Being able to successfully clear the board of enemies each turn is fantastic if you can manage it, but even if you can do so without taking damage, you might need to consider where it leaves your units positioned for next turn, or whether you're putting a key ability on cooldown to handle a relatively minor problem and risking it being inaccessible when you truly need it. In most cases, you won't even have that luxury, instead having to order your units to body block shots with their own mechs to protect essential buildings, or leaving civilians to the whims of chance so you can retrieve a crashed pod which might contain a potentially game-altering piece of equipment. Crucially, the one recurring dice roll you will encounter, a chance for attacked structures to withstand damage, is low enough that you can never rely on it being a get-out, but it does add an exciting moment that one time when the odds do go in your favour. The risk-reward system is further increased by the option to take on the final challenge in a run after completing anywhere from 2 to 4 islands, meaning you have to decide if you feel strong enough for the end game now or whether you want to try and power up further, with the caveat that the longer you take to arrive, the tougher that final Vec base will be. Into the Breach already offers so much with just your base team of mechs. There are so many potential upgrades and different pilot and skill combinations that you could get a ton of replay value out of simply going through it over and over with the Rift Walkers. However, each of the 9 squads feels almost like playing a different game thanks to their incredibly distinct arsenals which offer up a wild variety of playstyle opportunities. The Rusting Hulks, for example, suppress and damage enemies across large swathes of the battlefield using their electric smoke, while Blitzkrieg focuses all their attention into setting up large chain reactions for their main mech's Lightning Whip. Every squad also comes with their own set of unique achievements for efficiently utilising each mech's special skill set, as well as rewarding you for beating the game on each difficulty at each length. If that still isn't enough variety, you can also build full custom squads to try and come up with your own unique mech combinations. But even after all this time, I'm still wrapping my head around the best strategies for each of the main squads. Furthermore, you can bring your best pilot over between runs, incentivising you to hold on to anyone with a particularly handy ability. The characters themselves, each of whom you will encounter many times over as you warp between the parallel timelines of each successive playthrough, are well written, and I became attached to their particular quirks and attitudes the more they popped up. I spent quite some time with Into the Breach, yet I feel like I've barely begun to scratch the surface of its potential depth. This is a game with nearly infinite possibilities, almost none of which are perfect answers to the problems presented, and I absolutely love trying to fathom out which solutions will get me by in the least painful manner each time.
You bastards
Number 3. Return of the Obra Dinn. I'm a sucker for a good murder mystery, and Return of the Obra Dinn has 60 of them at once, so it was already off to a good start. From its opening moments, Obra Dinn is just dripping with style and atmosphere. The gorgeous throwback 1-bit visual style, the tight confined setting jam-packed with secrets, the ethereal soundtrack that weaves between naval pomp, haunting melancholy and otherworldly terror. The opening scenes have a foreboding quiet to them as you clunk gently across the top deck of this empty vessel, the wood creaking gently in the wind and waves softly slapping against the boat's hull. Things start off so simply, with a desperate mutiny attempt in the captain's cabin, only for Captain Whittle himself to end his own life after fending off the attempt. Immediately things unravel as you uncover nightmarish scenes of the crew being torn apart and hurled overboard by a vast kraken just hours beforehand. From there on out, the decks of the Obra Dinn are opened up, and as you enter each new section of the ship, the bodies quickly begin to pile up. Exploring more and more of the boat, uncovering its deeper secrets and more terrifying tales, was utterly compelling. The non-linear structure of the reveals only serves to make things more fascinating, as each initial find plops you into another point in the timeline, allowing you to take each snapshot of the moment of a character's demise and work your way backwards through the scene by finding the recently deceased form of the previous lost soul and using that to uncover their final moments in turn. Return of the Obra Dinn also does a phenomenal job with its pacing. It would have been easy for many of the early identities and fates to be obvious and the last few to be so tough as to feel like trial and error. Instead, there's a really nice balance, with some characters' identities being immediately obvious but their fates seeming unclear, whilst others might have met an end so chaotic or sudden that it can be difficult to tell exactly who they were. Thankfully, the game always allows you to match any body you find to a face on one of the two crew's portraits. This means that it's always reasonable to keep track of who is who, even when you're dealing with a lot of potential clues at once. Crucially, you need to correctly identify the full information for 3 separate characters for them to be marked off as correct, which is just enough to prevent you from being able to luck your way into things without being so demanding as feeling as though you're stumbling through with no idea how close you are to the truth. Every time that lock-in chime plays, it's a fresh hit of relief and adrenaline, freeing you to focus on other crew members safe in your current knowledge. Whittling down names from the manifest becomes vital later, as many of the crew members, especially the low-ranking seamen, often have little to distinguish them from one another, whereas the top-ranking fellows can more easily be identified by their clothes, location, equipment, or the activities you find them engaged in, fatal or otherwise. I actually found myself scrawling pages upon pages of handwritten notes over the course of my time with the Return of the Obra Dinn. I realised at some point that I probably didn't actually need to note down a lot of the details that I had, yet I became so engrossed in the fantasy that it just felt right to record every single sliver of potentially pertinent information. I was also astonished that for a crew of 60, most of whom were your traditionally salty seamen, I found it remarkably easy to keep track of who was who and exactly where on the boat they'd met their tragic demise. Every single scene you bear witness to is so memorable and each so distinct in its construction even when they happened mere moments apart that I was able to instantly recall where and when basically every single incident had taken place. To pack such a tight space with so many sad and horrific incidents and yet to do so with such intricacy as to make them all uniquely memorable is the kind of astonishing achievement that I suspect only works quite so well as it does because it all came from the mind of one man. Lucas Pope has made something truly unforgettable with Return of the Obra Dinn. I might even go so far as to say frustratingly unforgettable, as this might now sit atop my list of games I wish I could wipe from my memory so I could play them fresh again. I've been desperately aching to replay it ever since the moment it was all neatly wrapped up, yet even now, many months after finishing it, many of the finer details are still fresh in my mind. Return of the Obra Dinn is an incredible achievement. Its unique look and hypnotic soundtrack had me on board from minute 1, and the narrative hooks and mysteries had me gripped through to its final conclusion. It was always just puzzling enough to make me think, even for its simpler answers, but never quite so frustrating that I felt compelled to simply look up solutions. I did take a couple of small pointers that helped me to notice something which I had previously been overlooking, but I suspect that had I given myself slightly more time, I probably would have gotten there eventually. I can't emphasize this enough. If you have any interest in mysteries, this one is utterly essential. Number 2, Yakuza 6: The Song of Life.
またこの町に帰ってきちまったか。
I'd only started my journey through the Yakuza series a little over a year prior to the arrival of Yakuza 6, so I always knew that there was a chance going in that some of the emotional weight wouldn't land without a deep knowledge of the interim events between the first game and this one. I needn't have worried. Yakuza 6 is an astonishing final act to the Kiryu Kazuma saga, bringing many long-running threads to a close, but also telling a fantastic standalone tale. As always, probably the Yakuza series' greatest strength is in its characterization. Yakuza 6's cast features a wealth of new faces alongside a handful of old faithfuls and the occasional returning cameo. There are so many people you meet along the way that in most games it'd be easy to forget the majority of them, yet even many of the most incidental encounters here are still fresh in my memory thanks to a striking emotional beat, a clever piece of comedy, or some wonderful words of wisdom imparted from the Dragon of Dojima, something which happens a lot more here and shows his growth from the early days where he was the one learning all the important life lessons along his journey. At Yakuza 6's heart is the Hirose family, a small-time group of goofballs who hold court over the tiny fishing village of Onomichi in Hiroshima. The Hirose family are led by their hot-headed leader Nagamo, someone who won my heart so completely that if you've watched my entire Game of the Year series to this point, you're likely sick of hearing me effuse lovingly about him. But every member of the family feels integral, and they all get their moments to shine over the course of the adventure. In particular, Beats Takeshi turns in an astounding performance as family patriarch Hirose, the chirpy old Yakuza dad with a dark, dangerous past, while his Battle Royale co-star Tatsuya Fujiwara shines as Yuta, the youngest of the family, who takes centre stage as events begin to unfold towards the back half. It's also great seeing familiar faces Akiyama and Date take key roles in the events, and even as someone coming in having not played the games Akiyama was originally introduced in, I found his relationship with Kiryu was immediately understandable, and watching it play out here only further inspired me to go back to those past titles and see his stories play out for myself. Of course, everything ultimately revolves around one man and his family, Kiryu Kazuma. The Dragon of Dojima is back in force for one final time, and seeing the leap from those fiery early days to his final adventure, older, wiser, but just as impulsive as ever, offers a real broad spectrum for character growth that most game series don't have the opportunity or space to really show off. It also allows for lots of goofiness, with older dad Kiryu having to contend with all sorts of modern technology, including devious smartphone apps, mischievous drones, and saucy online chat rooms. The wackiness doesn't stop there, of course. As with the rest of the series, Yakuza 6 deftly balances out its serious emotional main narrative with a whole wealth of goofy side quests and minigames, including an intense underwater spearfishing minigame which culminates in showdowns with giant deadly sea monsters, plenty of opportunities for karaoke, and lots of returning Sega classics and the ability to just straight up play Virtua Fighter 5 in the arcade. However, there are also many sub-stories which play nicely into the central narrative's themes of finding forgiveness and acceptance. Several of these pop up in the three primary side activities: the New Gaudi snack bar, the Satuchi Warriors baseball team, and the clan creator. The first of these sees Kiryu becoming a regular at a small Hirose bar, making friends with the locals and the mama, engaging in spirited conversations with them, and occasionally helping them to solve their woes. It feels a little like having a Yakuza take on Cheers, this delightful mini sitcom packed with gentle ribbing and softball jokes inserted alongside the main game. Conversely, joining up with the Satuchi Warriors turns the action into a baseball management sim, where you're scouting players during your other adventures and then picking your lineups for each game in the season. You also get to take a couple of hits yourself during key moments, but for the most part, things really come down to your managerial capabilities. Things get even more strategic in the Clan Creator, which is presented as a top-down tower attack mode where you must deploy generic goons alongside an ever-expanding roster of unique, stronger fighters to take down rival factions. Oh, and I should mention that the main antagonists in this mode are all big-name wrestlers from leading promotion New Japan Pro Wrestling. Seeing Kiryu square off against the legendary Rainmaker Kazuchika Okada, bump heads against the sublime Master Thief Toru Yano, come to an understanding with Ace Hiroshi Tanahashi, or drop Tetsuya Naito's iconic catchphrase, Tranquilo, Asenayo, on him just adds that extra level of glorious silliness to proceedings. It's not really a surprise at this point that RGG Studio continues to come up with these clever side activities that dramatically diverge from the main game's action, but it is impressive how consistently they manage to make them just as fun and engaging throughout. As for that main action, it's been revamped from the Yakuza 0 engine to move away from canned attack and reaction animations in favour of a much more physics-based system that uses tracking and ragdoll to more naturally lead punches and kicks towards their target. The result actually feels a little less snappy at first and can often lead to some slightly bizarre interactions, but when it flows just right, it looks and feels so good to pull off a big beatdown. Of course, there are no shortage of weapon attacks and heat moves to spice the variety up too. Just as with other aspects of Yakuza 6, it would be easy to imagine a world where you tire of the brawling after a while, especially considering that I'd played through another 2 of these games not long prior to this. But it manages to hold up over the course of the adventure. The revamped upgrade system also feels a little more well designed to me and does a good job of encouraging you to try out all the different restaurants around Kamurocho and Onomichi, as well as spending plenty of time in the officially licensed Rise Up gym. This then gives you even more reason to browse the cuisine on offer, as your personal trainer will direct you to find meals that fit specific dietary requirements. That's just one more touch which is emblematic of the sheer depth and attention to detail given to every aspect in the Yakuza series. As with Yakuza 0 in 2017, I could go on and still not cover everything on offer here. There's also the opportunity to help a struggling cat cafe by feeding and gradually befriending a whole multitude of stray cats dotted around both of the main locales. You could easily spend a dozen hours quietly playing Mahjong, and I likely did. There's even a hostess club where you can spend time getting to know each of the various hostesses through a detailed conversation minigame. For everything going on in Yakuza 6 though, what really makes it shine is that central narrative, a winding tale packed with all manner of twists and turns. Even by the standards of the series, it features some of the most far-reaching consequences and wide-ranging faction interplay to date. It manages to be at once a compelling standalone tale, a satisfying final act to Kiryu and Haruka's story, and an emotional farewell to one of gaming's longest-running and most beloved protagonists. Safe travels, Kiryu Kazuma. It's been an incredible ride. Number 1. Monster Hunter World. For so many years, Monster Hunter has been a name which instantly divides the room. It has long seen extreme popularity in Japan and also found itself a very dedicated fanbase in the West who adored its complexity and systemic depth. But with that came an intimidating on-ramp which kept so many people, myself included, away for a long time. Monster Hunter World was Capcom's biggest play. Could they finally transform this beloved series into a big-budget home console title that made itself approachable to a wider audience without losing what made the series special? I still remember seeing the announcement trailer for the first time on the Sony stage, suddenly realising that this gorgeous open environment was a Monster Hunter game. I immediately decided that this was going to be my best shot at understanding the series. I'd briefly dipped in before but never stuck with any of them for long enough to truly get it. I think in my heart I always suspected that I had it in me to fall in love with Monster Hunter, I just didn't expect to do so quite as hard as I did in 2018. Monster Hunter World isn't a game that instantly reveals its magic to you, but that doesn't mean that the opening hours aren't impressive. The character creator offered up a wealth of options for me to craft my rugged hunter and her faithful Palico companion, and from the frantic opening shipwreck sequence to those first initial forays into the lush landscape of the ancient forest, World immediately demonstrates its rich, detailed ecosystems and begins to introduce you to the titular monsters who will be your primary quarries for the coming hours. Those initial hours are fairly gentle, pitting you against relatively slow or fragile foes such as the gluttonous Great Jagras or the rambunctious charging Baroth. This lets you get a handle on some of the systems before things get too chaotic. But you might also run into a few other monsters while out on those early hunts, such as Anjanath, who will send you packing back to camp in just a couple of hits, letting you know that you've got a long journey ahead of you. By the time I'd really started to wrap my head around the moveset of my chosen weapon type, the fast, versatile, combo-driven longsword, and begun to learn my way around the early maps, the game threw Toby Kadachi my way. This agile, lightning-infused giant sugar glider caught me off guard with just how fast it moved and really forced me to start learning its movements and using the environment to my advantage rather than simply avoiding one attack and wailing on the monster as I had been doing previously. This ended up being emblematic of World's difficulty curve, which does a phenomenal job of gradually ramping up the intensity over time to keep you on your toes and forcing you to continue improving your tactics and your play. Just as you think you've really gotten to grips with things, the game loudly announces that everything you've accomplished so far was part of something called low rank, and that moving forward into high rank, you'll have to fight new tougher variants of all the monsters you'd previously conquered. In many games, the idea of repeating all the things I'd already done at a higher difficulty might have just put me off, but Monster Hunter works because the high rank monsters have new moves and behaviours, and they often move between different biomes, meaning you have to adopt tactics you might not have used for a given monster before. Furthermore, they don't wait too long before tossing in variants such as the Pink Rathian and Azure Rathalos that further change up their behaviours, and the introduction of a new area, the Elder's Recess, brings with it a variety of completely new monsters to add to the mix again, which then leads into late game showdowns against several mighty Elder Dragons, probably the most exciting encounters of the whole campaign. Perhaps the most dramatic change of all going into high rank though is the arrival of world's most notorious troublemaker, Bazelgeuse. This terrifying, screeching beast is drawn to conflicts and can show up at any point while you're mid-fight with another monster, dropping payloads of explosive scales from high above or crashing headfirst to the ground in devastating fashion. Its arrival at any time is accompanied by its pompous, bombastic signature theme, which immediately takes over the soundtrack in much the same manner as Basil himself takes centre stage in any encounter that he decides to show up for. Of course, no hunt should be undertaken without adequate preparation beforehand, and your arrival in high rank also signifies the point at which your gear starts to really matter. Previously, you could make armor pieces that might nab you a couple of useful skills and top up your defense just enough to keep you safe for the upcoming encounters, but as you move into the mid-game and beyond, you start to really pick out combinations that can dramatically improve your ability to take on world's deadliest beasties. Fighting a new enemy for the first time in any game is always an inherently exciting experience because you don't know what you're up against and have to perform this cautious dance as you try to analyse what sort of danger might come your way. However, actually conquering a monster in world becomes even more exciting because alongside the satisfaction of besting your foe comes the opportunity to take a look at their armour and weapons and see what new possibilities they might unlock. Once I finished the main campaign, I could have easily walked away, but instead I was immediately compelled to start building new sets and see what else I could do. I mentioned earlier that I stuck to the longswords throughout the campaign, and I want to emphasise that at no point did I tire of the gameplay. Even just one single weapon type offers up enough variety that learning its strengths and weaknesses against every monster you face is a delight, and sticking to just longsword meant I was able to really devote my attention to learning how to use the environment in combat as well as my weapon. It also meant I was able to build a variety of different elemental and status inflicting longswords to specialise against the various weaknesses of the creatures I was going up against. After finishing the main progression, however, I began to diverge into other weapons. Firstly, the hammer, with its focus on landing big knockout blows that encourages you to closely learn monster attack animations. Then I moved on to the charge blade, with its complex moveset that charges up and stores energy in the weapon before unleashing it for big bursts of damage. After that was the sword and shield, which lets you dart around between the monster's legs, trip them up easily and mount quickly even from flat ground. Then came the lance with its incredible damage blocking capabilities and ability to keep up relentless pressure on your foe, the bow with its high maneuverability and potential to quickly knock monsters out or inflict debilitating status effects, and so on and so on and so on, until I'd spent time with all 14 of the different weapon varieties. My expectation had been that I would find several of them that would click with me if I tried all of them out. What I didn't expect was that I ended up having a light bulb moment with every single one of them that made me truly understand the appeal of that weapon and want to keep using it. At this point, my hour count with Monster Hunter World stretches well into the hundreds, and I can't see myself putting it down anytime soon, especially with the release of massive endgame expansion Iceborne in 2019. But before I wrap up here, it would be remiss of me not to talk about the glue that really brings Monster Hunter together, its personality. For just how much this is a series about combat and stats and numbers and crunching out build combinations, the reason it works so well is the loving care and attention applied to every aspect of its presentation. Just walking around the main hub in Astera is a delight, with members of the Commission hustling and bustling back and forth carrying out tasks. Before you go out on a hunt, you get to sit down for a delicious slap-up meal, handcrafted by the trusty Meowscular chef and his band of Palico assistants. And when you return from your mission, you're greeted by a cute little Poogie, who you can pet with a trivial little minigame that brought a smile to my face every single one of the hundreds of times I did it. The weapons and armour are gorgeous, and I spent almost as long mulling over the aesthetics of my outfits as I did the skill sets. While the narrative in Monster Hunter games is often considered to be somewhat superficial, I actually really enjoyed the story of World as well. I love the false finish midway through where you conclusively solve your initial central problem only for another big issue to spring up a little while later as an indirect consequence. I loved the interplay between all the members of the research commission and how everyone actually has a specific job they specialise in rather than all just standing around the hub looking sheepish. I loved the relationship between my hunter and her handler and found myself getting more emotional at times than I would have perhaps expected thanks to the investment I'd built up over my time with the game. Monster Hunter World is an astonishingly deep, rich game that continues to give back to you the more you pour into it. Whether I was hunting alone or with friends, completing simple optional quests or taking down diabolical endgame adversaries, I never felt my time was being wasted. I always had goals I wanted to work towards, whether defined by the game directly or by my own desire to craft some new gear. For a game that asks you to make such a time commitment to truly get on board, Monster Hunter World pays you back with interest, and its colourful world and charming personality ensured that every moment I spent with it throughout my adventures was an absolute delight. Fans of the series often say that everyone loves the Monster Hunter games, you just have to play one for long enough to realise it. Well, realise it I did, and there's no question that, both by time spent and consistent enjoyment throughout that time, Monster Hunter World was my favourite game of 2018. And with that, we've made it to the very end of this whole ridiculous endeavour. Thank you very much for watching, especially if you made it this far. I realise this is a weird time in the year to put this out, but I hope you enjoyed it anyway, and if you did, a like would be greatly appreciated and I would love to hear what you would have chosen in the comments down below. That's going to do it for now, but be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't and let me know if there's anything in particular you'd like to see me do more of this year. I've been Ken, and I'll catch you on the next one. Cheers!